My name is Sarah, and I am 35 years old. To the outside world, I am a dedicated emergency room nurse. A woman trained to remain calm when everything around her is falling apart. I spend 12 hours a day stitching up wounds and holding the hands of strangers during the worst moments of their lives. I thought I knew what a crisis looked like. I thought I knew what shock felt like, but I did not truly understand the meaning of the word until a Tuesday in October, at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. It began with a low rumble that vibrated through the soles of my feet, followed instantly by a violent shaking that turned my world upside down. The earthquake lasted only 11 seconds, but in that brief window of time, the foundation of my life literally cracked. I grabbed my 5-year-old daughter, Emily, and shielded her body with mine under our sturdy kitchen table while our apartment groaned and twisted around us. When the shaking finally stopped, the silence was terrifying. The city inspector arrived 3 hours later and slapped a bright red tag on our front door. The structural damage was too severe. The load-bearing walls were compromised. It was unsafe to enter. In the span of an afternoon, I had gone from a self-sufficient medical professional to a homeless single mother with nothing but a suitcase and a terrified child clinging to my leg. With no other options and the local hotels fully booked by other displaced families, I swallowed my pride and drove to the affluent suburbs to ask for help. I pulled into the circular driveway of my father's sprawling estate. My father, Robert, lived in a 4-bedroom fortress with his second wife, Linda. It was a house with 3 empty guest rooms and a dedicated game room for his step-grandchildren. It was a house that had more than enough space to shelter his own blood. I stood on the front porch, still covered in the dust of my ruined apartment, holding Emily's hand. When Robert opened the door, he did not pull us into a hug. He did not ask if we were hurt. He looked at the red tag notice in my hand and then looked at my daughter with a cold, calculating expression. "You can stay here, Sarah," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. "But there is simply no space for the child." I froze. I asked him to repeat himself, certain that the stress of the earthquake had affected my hearing. But he said it again. He claimed that having a 5-year-old in the house would be too disruptive to their routine. Linda appeared behind him, smiling a smile that did not reach her eyes. She chimed in, suggesting that I should send the girl to stay with a friend or perhaps find a shelter for her, while I stayed in their guest room alone. They were standing in a home with 4,000 square feet of space, yet they were telling me there was no room for a 40-pound child who was clutching a stuffed bear and trembling with fear. They were choosing their comfort over their granddaughter's safety. I looked at my father, a man who had always preached about family values to his friends, and I realized he was a fraud. I did not cry. I did not beg. I simply looked him in the eye, said the word noted, and walked back to my car. As I buckled Emily into her seat, the sadness in my chest hardened into something much colder. I drove away knowing that the earthquake had destroyed my apartment, but my father had just destroyed our relationship. Safety came in the form of Rachel's guest room, a quiet sanctuary away from the dust of my collapsed apartment and the cruelty of my father's front porch. Rachel had made up the bed and fed Emily warm milk until she fell asleep, but for me, rest was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cold indifference in Robert's face as he turned his own grandchild away. Restless and haunted by a rejection that felt more like a physical wound, I found myself drawn to the closet where I had stashed a battered cardboard box labeled "Mom's Things" in permanent marker. It was a relic I had carted from apartment to apartment for years, a collection of memories I hadn't possessed the emotional bandwidth to open since my mother died decades prior. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the smell of old paper and grief, sifting through the artifacts of a life cut short. Beneath a folded, moth-eaten quilt and some photo albums with peeling corners, my hand brushed against something thick and heavy. It was a large, yellowed manila envelope. The postmark read 2003, but it was the return address that made my heart stop beating for a terrifying second. Edith Prescott. My father had told me for 20 years that my grandmother Edith was senile, that she had moved away to Arizona, and that she didn't remember us. He had painted a picture of a woman lost to dementia, yet here was her handwriting, clear and firm. With trembling hands, I broke the seal. Inside, I found a letter written on lavender stationery that still carried a faint scent of her perfume, clipped to a dense legal document. The letter was a voice from the past, filled with a love I had been starved of. "My dearest Sarah," it read, the ink unfaded by time, "I have set up the Prescott Family Trust for you. It includes the house on Birchwood and $210,000 in savings. When you turn 25, it is all yours. Don't let anyone tell you that you aren't provided for. Love, Grandma." I dropped the letter and picked up the attached deed. It confirmed everything. I was the sole beneficiary of a trust established in 2004. I sat there in the dark, doing the math, and the nausea hit me harder than the earthquake had. I was 35 years old. I should have received this inheritance 10 years ago. My father was listed as the trustee. He had never mentioned it, not once. The realization washed over me with the force of a tidal wave. The man who claimed he had no space for his granddaughter was living a life of luxury funded entirely by the money he had stolen from me. He hadn't just rejected us. He had robbed us to build the very fortress that was now closed to his own blood. Fueled by a volatile mixture of adrenaline and rage, I did not sleep that night. Instead, I turned the floor of Rachel's guest room into a command center. At 3 a.m, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of my laptop screen, I began an investigation that would unravel my entire life. I accessed the county assessor's online portal to trace the history of the Birchwood property mentioned in the trust deed. The digital trail was damning and remarkably easy to follow. The public records showed a quitclaim deed filed in 2019. It detailed the transfer of the property from the Prescott Family Trust directly to Robert and Linda for a recorded sale price of $0. A few months later, the records showed they sold the house for a significant profit. I cross-referenced the dates, and the timeline was undeniable. The sale coincided perfectly with the purchase of their current sprawling estate, the very house where they had just told me there was no room for my daughter. They had literally built their fortress of comfort on the foundation of my stolen inheritance. But the financial theft was only half of the betrayal. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I typed my grandmother Edith's name into a search engine, fully expecting to find an obituary. I had been told for 20 years that she was senile, that she had moved away, and that she had forgotten us. I prepared myself to find a grave. Instead, the search results returned a resident profile at the Sunridge Senior Living Community in Arizona. There was a photo. She looked older. Yes, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She was listed as an active member of the Welcome Committee. She was alive, she was lucid, and she was only a few states away. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Robert had lied to me for 2 decades. He had told me she didn't want to see me to keep us apart. He had severed the bond between a grandmother and granddaughter not to protect me, but to ensure no one would ask questions about the trust fund. I realized then that my independence, the trait my father had always praised me for, wasn't a character lesson he had instilled in me. It was a necessary condition for his crime. He needed me desperate, busy, and distant, so I would never look closely at the family finances. He had stolen my past to pay for his future. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the suburbs, but I had been awake for hours. I paced the length of Rachel's backyard, clutching my phone like a lifeline, watching the minutes tick by until it was a reasonable hour in Arizona. I was terrified. I had spent 20 years believing this woman had abandoned me, and I was about to find out if my father's lies were the only thing standing between us. When the clock finally hit 7, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tap the screen. I dialed the number for the Sunridge Senior Community. The front desk patched me through to her room. The line rang 3 times, each ring echoing in the hollow pit of my stomach. Then, a click. A voice answered, thin and frail, but unmistakably the same voice that used to read me bedtime stories. "Hello?" she asked. I took a breath that shuddered in my chest. "Grandma?" It is Sarah." There was a silence on the other end that lasted for 3 agonizing seconds. I braced myself for rejection, for her to hang up, for her to tell me she didn't know who I was. Instead, I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by a sob that sounded like it had been held back for a lifetime. "Sarah?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Is that my baby girl?" The sound of her voice, filled with such undiluted love and longing, broke the dam I had built around my emotions. I stood in the grass and wept. We spoke for an hour, and with every sentence, the architecture of my father's deception became clearer. Edith revealed that she hadn't forgotten me. She had written to me every single Christmas for 22 years. She had sent birthday cards, letters, and photos. Every single one of them had been returned to her, the envelopes marked "Return to Sender" in Robert's distinct, jagged handwriting. My father had told her that I wanted no contact. He told her I had moved on, that I was busy, and that I didn't want to be bothered by an old woman. "He stole you from me," Edith wept, her grief vibrating through the phone line. "He told me you hated me." But when I explained what I had found, the trust deed, the sale of the Birchwood house, and the fact that I was currently homeless while he lived in luxury, her sorrow instantly hardened into steel. The frail old woman vanished, replaced by the matriarch who had built that estate. "I never sold that house," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, protective register. "I never signed a transfer. That trust was for you, and only you." She told me to stop crying. She told me that we weren't just going to be sad. We were going to be victorious. "We are going to get it back, Sarah," she promised. "Every single cent. And don't worry about evidence. I kept them all. I have 22 years of returned envelopes with his handwriting on them. I have the proof." I hung up the phone with a new sensation coursing through my veins. I wasn't just a rejected daughter anymore. I was part of a team. This wasn't just a family reunion. It was the formation of a legal alliance that was about to bring my father's world crashing down. I did not waste a single hour wallowing in sadness. The tears I shed in the backyard were the last ones I intended to cry for a very long time. Through a trusted referral from Rachel's cousin, I retained the services of Nathan Okafor, a high-powered attorney specializing in trust and estate litigation. Nathan was a man of few words, possessing a calm, surgical intensity that reminded me of the best trauma doctors I worked with, the kind who never raised their voices because they were the most competent people in the room. I sat in his office, surrounded by the smell of old paper and printer toner, and laid out my life on his mahogany desk: the trust deed, the property records, and the handwritten letter from my grandmother. Nathan listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he removed his reading glasses and looked at me with intense seriousness. He explained that what I had described was not merely a family dispute. Robert had not just been a bad father. He had breached his fiduciary duty as a trustee, a legal obligation that required him to act solely in my best interest. Selling the house and taking the money for himself wasn't just selfish. It was likely felony embezzlement. Our strategy was methodical. We sent a formal demand to the bank for all distribution records associated with the trust. When the packet arrived a week later, the evidence was insulting in its clumsiness. The withdrawal authorizations were signed by Sarah M. Prescott, but the moment I looked at them, I felt a spike of rage. I have signed my name thousands of times on patient charts and medication orders. My signature has a sharp, distinct downstroke on the S and a closed loop on the P. The signature on these documents was curvy and hesitant, the work of someone trying to copy a memory. Nathan immediately hired a forensic document examiner, Dr. Sims, who confirmed with a high degree of probability that the signatures were forgeries. But the final nail in the coffin was the notary stamp. The documents had been notarized by a woman named Janet Fry. I recognized the name immediately. She was a close friend of my stepmother, Linda, from their church group. The picture was complete. My father had forged my name to liquidate my inheritance, Linda's friend had stamped it, and they had used my money to buy the mansion where they were currently sleeping. Nathan began drafting a petition that read like a medical chart for a dying family. Counts of breach of duty, fraud, and civil theft. We were no longer asking for answers. We were preparing for war. While the legal machinations turned silently in the background, my father and stepmother sensed the shifting tide. Perhaps Robert had noticed the certified mail receipts, or maybe his guilty conscience was finally making him paranoid about the questions I had asked regarding the trust. Regardless of the trigger, they decided to launch a preemptive strike. They couldn't control the legal facts, so they attempted to control the social narrative. The campaign began on a Wednesday evening. Linda took to Facebook and posted a long, performative narrative accompanied by a photo of me from high school. To the casual observer, it looked like a plea for support. In reality, it was a character assassination. She claimed that I had become mentally unstable since the trauma of the earthquake and was making wild, false accusations against the family who had only ever loved and supported me. She wove a story where they were the victims of my ingratitude, asking for prayers as they navigated my breakdown. The post garnered hundreds of likes and sympathetic comments from relatives and neighbors who had no idea they were clicking like on a lie. The digital flying monkeys arrived shortly after. Family members I hadn't spoken to in years began texting me, their messages dripping with judgment. They told me I was ungrateful, that I was breaking my father's heart, and that I should drop whatever vendetta I was holding against the people who raised me. But the most vicious blow came from Robert himself. He sent me an email at midnight, bypassing the public forum for a direct attack on my greatest vulnerability, my motherhood. In the email, he threatened to expose me as an unfit mother. He had the audacity to claim that by staying with friends instead of family, I was endangering Emily's stability. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its cruelty. This was the man who had looked at my homeless 5-year-old and told her there was no space for her. Now, he was twisting my survival into negligence. It was a classic manipulation tactic, designed to make the victim look like the aggressor and to scare me into submission. A younger version of me would have taken the bait. I would have screamed, defended myself in the comments section, and engaged in the drama they were desperate to create. But I was not that person anymore. I did not respond to a single text. I did not comment on the post. Instead, I screenshotted everything. I captured the timestamps, the threats, and the lies. I forwarded the entire packet to Nathan with a simple subject line: "Add this to the file." I knew that in the court of law, their attempts to intimidate a plaintiff and smear a witness wouldn't look like righteous indignation. It would look like desperation. They were trying to win a popularity contest. I was building a case for a felony conviction. The deadline for Robert to respond to our initial demand letter came and went without a serious offer. His attorney, a budget lawyer who seemed more accustomed to handling traffic tickets than complex fraud cases, sent a feeble response claiming that the trust withdrawals were made with implied family consent. It was a stalling tactic, and a poor one. Nathan did not have the patience for games. He decided it was time to escalate the situation from a private dispute to a public reckoning. He filed a motion for an expedited hearing and hired a professional process server to deliver the summons. The date chosen for service was calculated with brutal precision. We needed a time when we could guarantee Robert would be at home. That Saturday happened to be the date of the lavish birthday party they were throwing for my stepsister, Megan. I was not there to witness the event personally, as I had no desire to step foot on that property again, but Rachel's cousin lives 2 doors down and provided a description that was vividly satisfying. 30 guests were gathered in Robert's manicured backyard, drinking expensive champagne and celebrating beneath arches of pink and gold balloons. The air was filled with laughter and music, until a uniformed sheriff's deputy walked through the side gate. The music stopped abruptly. The deputy walked right past the caterers and the stunned guests, marching directly up to my father. He handed Robert a thick, heavy envelope. Robert took it with a confused smile, likely thinking it was a late gift or a delivery he had forgotten. He opened the packet in front of everyone. As he pulled out the documents, the color drained from his face faster than water from a drain. It was not a greeting card. It was a lawsuit. Inside the packet was the forensic report proving he had forged my signature, but the true dagger was the document attached to the back, a sworn, notarized declaration from Grandma Edith. Linda leaned over his shoulder to read it. When she saw Edith's name, a woman she had told everyone was senile and dead, she nearly collapsed against the patio table. The facade of the respectable, wealthy patriarch crumbled in seconds. His friends, neighbors, and church members watched in stunned silence as Robert realized that the foundation of his life, and the very house he was standing in, was built on a crime that had just been exposed for the world to see. The reckoning arrived on a Tuesday morning in the fluorescent-lit halls of the county probate court. It was a setting stripped of the balloons and champagne that had camouflaged my father's cruelty just days before. I walked into the courtroom wearing my navy blue hospital scrubs underneath a gray blazer. My attorney, Nathan, had offered me time to change, but I refused. I wanted the judge to see exactly who I was, a working mother who saved lives for a living, standing opposite a man who stole from his own blood to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. Across the aisle, the transformation in my father was pathetic. Robert sat hunched over the defense table, his usually immaculate suit looking rumpled, his arrogance replaced by the twitchy, sweat-dampened fear of a man realizing he has run out of exits. His budget lawyer, a man who looked like he handled mostly traffic tickets, was flipping nervously through a folder that was visibly thinner than ours. But the most powerful presence in the room wasn't the judge, or the attorneys, or even my father. It was Grandma Edith, at 82 years old. Having flown in from Arizona the night before, she sat in the front row with a spine of steel, radiating the kind of quiet, terrifying authority that comes from knowing you are the only honest person in the room. When she took the stand, the room went silent. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. She spoke with a clarity that sliced through 22 years of lies. "I established the Prescott Family Trust for one person," she testified, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "My granddaughter, Sarah. I never authorized a sale. I never signed a transfer. I was told by my son-in-law that Sarah didn't want me in her life." She paused, looking directly at Robert, who couldn't even meet her eyes. "I have 22 years of returned letters in his handwriting to prove otherwise." Robert's lawyer tried to salvage the situation with a weak, fumbling argument about implied family consent, suggesting that as the patriarch, Robert had the informal right to manage the funds for the greater good of the family. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. He looked over his spectacles with a glare that withered the defense attorney instantly. "Counselor," the judge snapped, "fiduciary duty is not subject to implied consent. Theft does not become legal simply because it is domestic." The ruling was swift, brutal, and absolute. The judge immediately removed Robert as the trustee, citing gross misconduct and fraud. He ordered Robert and Linda to repay the full $210,000 of the principal, plus years of statutory interest, totaling nearly $248,000. But the final blow was the most poetic. Because the forensic accountant had traced the stolen funds directly to the down payment of Robert's current mansion, the judge placed a court-ordered lien on the property. He gave Robert a strict deadline. He had 90 days to produce the cash. If he couldn't, the house, the sprawling estate with the game room and the guest suites, the very house where he had told me there was no space for my 5-year-old daughter, would be seized and sold at auction to satisfy the debt. The silence lasted exactly 7 days. A week after the judge's gavel struck the wood, finalizing the judgment that dismantled my father's life, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I stood in Rachel's kitchen, watching the screen light up with the word "Dad," and felt a phantom ache in my chest. But the last remaining thread of the girl who used to wait by the window for him to come home made me slide the icon to green. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable. Gone was the bluster of the patriarch who had turned me away from his doorstep. Gone was the arrogance of the man who told me I should be proud of my struggle. In its place was a voice hollowed out by terror. Robert didn't demand, he begged. He told me that the bank was threatening foreclosure if they couldn't pay the judgment. He told me that Linda was depressed, that she wouldn't get out of bed, and that this lawsuit would ruin them. He tried to weaponize the one thing he had never actually valued: family. "How can you do this to us, Sarah?" he pleaded. "We are your flesh and blood." I held the phone, listening to the man who had ignored my struggles for a decade and erased my existence to steal my inheritance. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt the clinical detachment I rely on in the ER when I have to tell a family that there is nothing more we can do. I delivered the news with the same steady, flat precision. "You told me there was no space for my child in a house you bought with my money," I said, my voice cutting through his sobbing. "You forged my signature. You lied to my grandmother for 20 years, telling her I abandoned her just so you could keep stealing. You didn't act like family when I was homeless, Dad. You acted like a predator." He tried to interrupt, to offer excuses, but I cut him off. I won't make your life harder than the court did, Robert. But I certainly won't make it easier. The trust will be repaid. That is not negotiable. I hung up the phone and set it on the counter. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry. I simply ended the call. 60 days later, the for sale sign went up on the lawn of the sprawling estate where my daughter had been denied a bed. Robert and Linda sold the house at a significant loss to satisfy the court order. They were forced to downsize into a cramped condo on the edge of town. Their reputation in the community shattered as the public nature of the lawsuit exposed their cruelty. They had spent a lifetime building a facade of wealth and respectability, only to have it bulldozed by the truth they had tried to bury. 4 months later, the trust was fully restored. Every dollar my father had stolen, plus the interest mandated by the court, hit my account. I did not use the money to buy a luxury car or a vacation to the Maldives, as Robert likely would have done. Instead, I used it to secure something far more valuable: stability. I put a down payment on a modest, 2-bedroom cottage just half a mile from the hospital and 3 blocks from Emily's new school. It had a small yard where Emily could run, a kitchen with actual counter space for baking, and a front door that I painted a bright, cheerful red on our very first weekend. When I put down the paintbrush, Emily stood in the driveway, clutching her stuffed bear, and pointed at the door. "Mama," she said, her eyes wide. "It looks just like my drawing." I hugged her tightly, realizing that I hadn't just painted a door. I had brought to life the dream she had sketched on the morning of the earthquake, the dream of a home where she was safe and where she wasn't too big or too much for the space. The best part, however, was not the house itself, but who came to fill it. Grandma Edith moved back to California that winter, renting a sunny 1-bedroom apartment just 10 minutes away. The 3 generations, Edith, Sarah, and Emily, reclaimed the time that had been stolen from us. We spent our Saturdays together, filling the kitchen with the smell of cornbread and planting lavender along the front walk, just as Grandma had done in her old house on Birchwood Street. I cut all ties with the toxicity of my father and stepmother. I realized that for years, I had been begging for a seat at a table where I wasn't wanted, trying to shrink myself to fit into their narrow definition of family. I finally understood that peace was infinitely more valuable than their performative approval. I stopped knocking on a door that was never going to open for me, and instead, I built my own table, in my own house, where there is always enough space for the people I love. If you are watching this, and you have ever been made to feel like you are taking up too much space, or that you are a burden to the people who are supposed to carry you, please listen to me. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into a house that is too small for your spirit. You have the right to build your own walls, paint your own door, and choose who gets to walk through it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you believe that family is defined by love and action, not just blood, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and truth. And tell me in the comments, what does your red door look like? What is the dream you are building for yourself? I'll be reading your stories.